وسهلا بكم مشاهدينا في حلقة جديدة من حديث خاص. ضيفنا اليوم هو أنثوني سكاراموتشي الذي تولى منصب مدير الاتصالات في البيت الأبيض في ظل إدارة ترامب لمدة 11 يوما. 11 يوما كانت مدة كافية ليسطع نجمه في واشنطن ويدون اسمه في سجل الأوساط السياسية المؤثرة في العاصمة الأمريكية. Welcome, Mr. Scaramucci.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You work with big firms on Wall Street. You made very good money. You opened your own firm that ran $12 billion investments. And then we see you as Director of Communications at the White House.
Yeah.
What took you to Washington?
Well, there's a number of different things, and I'm obviously back at my firm today, but there's a number of different things. I became close friends with the President over a 5 or 6 year period. I met him 20 years ago, but after the Governor Romney campaign, we became close, and so when I went to work for him, I was doing a number of communications-like things, media surrogacy, both written advocacy in places like the Wall Street Journal, but also on television. And he had gone maybe 3 or 4 months without a communications director, and so he asked me to do the job, and that was an improbable thing for me to do, but it's very hard when you love your country. You know, I'm a very commercially minded person. I spent 30 years as an entrepreneur. Maybe in hindsight I should have stayed as an entrepreneur, but when you love your country and your friend, who happens to become the President of the United States, goes to Washington and asks you to come, you probably say yes, and so I did.
You served in the Trump administration for 11 days. 11,
yeah.
Not 10 days.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. It's also 954,000 seconds. It depends on how you want to think about it, you know.
Yeah, you're still good, in good touch with the President.
Sure.
Tell us about your experience at the White House. How was it, the first meeting with the White House?
Well, you know, look, I made a mistake with a reporter. I thought the conversation was off the record. The reporter's family was actually friends with my family, so it wasn't really that naive. It was just a betrayal of friendship. And so, but that was used basically by John Kelly to fire me. And so he was the chief of staff, newly named, and so I respected the decision. But what I was not going to do was allow a political decision or a power struggle between me and John Kelly to define my relationship with the President of the United States, who happens to be a personal friend. So I've kept my relationship with him. And I talk to him infrequently. I don't want to exaggerate that relationship, but I probably, since I left the White House last July, I probably talked to the President 15 or 16 times, so once or twice a month.
Well, how was the atmosphere at the White House? Tell us about the first time you met with President Trump after you assumed your position. How was the atmosphere like? Is he getting and does he read the briefings that everyone, you know, says he doesn't?
Well, he's reading a lot more than people want to give him credit for, and he spends a lot of time analyzing the news. In the Oval Office, there's a vestibule that leads you into the study, the President's study, and so he reconfigured that for himself. He's got this gigantic flat-screen TV in there, but on the desk, there's a stack of papers every morning that he's going through. Some of those are the intelligence briefings. Some of those are the local news, newspapers like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post, the New York Post, things like that. So he's a way bigger reader than people want to give him credit for. They try to characterize and stereotype him a certain way, and he's obviously got a very good nose for things and a very good instinct.
Let's talk politics. Does President Trump have a Middle East strategy?
No, there's a clear strategies in place. I think he really wants to see if he can disrupt some of the tension there, dial it back, and probably either redo a deal with the Iranians. Certainly he doesn't like the current deal, which is why he wants to rip that up. But I think he wants there to be peace, and obviously he wants there to be an end of a form of state-sponsored terrorism. And so my prediction is he'll get way more done than the typical president because he's willing to try new and different things. You know, as an example, he's willing to speak with the North Korean dictator. This is something that over the last 65 years people said wasn't a good thing to do, but he's somebody that's willing to breach the establishment orthodoxy of foreign policy. And so there's a deal to get done there. I think the Middle East is ready for economic stability, peace, prosperity. The Middle East does not want to fall behind the other family of nations as it relates to growth and economic opportunity for its people. And so some of the reforms that are happening in Saudi Arabia is a direct example of that. And when you think about Saudi Arabia and Iran, they sort of mirror each other. When Khomeini came to power and was way more radicalized. The Saudis, through the Wahhabists, got way more radicalized. And so this process of de-radicalization, I think, will also have a positive effect throughout the region.
When you were there for those 11 days, how many times did President Trump meet with then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson?
That's a good question. I have to really think about it, but I saw Rex almost every day that I was in the White House, so I would say he met with him very frequently.
Even though they had different views on all kinds of things?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a personal chemistry that you either have with President Trump or you don't. Rex Tillerson is a world-class human being. He was an Eagle Scout, ran one of the most successful oil companies in the world, and he started from scratch in that company and built himself up to where he is. He's clearly a statesman, but personality-wise, I think that you have to have either a click-in sort of chemistry with the president or not. Secretary of State Pompeo has that. They have a very strong, very positive vibe for each other, and so that could have been personality differences more than them both being just very good people with personality difference more than anything else.
At least up until the appointment of Pompeo, the White House and the State Department seemed to be, at least occasionally, at odds on Middle East strategy, with the Pentagon seemingly closer to state. Such differences have manifested themselves on the Syria and Iran issues, as well as Qatar. Are those differences still there now, do you think?
Well, you have to remember that there's an establishment orthodoxy and there's a permanent class of employees in both of those departments. So there's a certain standard view that's emanated from Washington for the last 30 to 40 years, really since Henry Kissinger and President Nixon had the mantle of leadership there. And so the president wants to try new things. He wants to break that orthodoxy. And so there will probably be continued tension there. But as long as Secretary Pompeo is in place, I think the State Department is certainly going to go in the direction that the president wants it to. You know, when you say that the Department of Defense, I think Secretary Mattis, somebody I have an enormous amount of respect for, I think is also willing to try new things with the president. I mean, we're a strong nation. Obviously, we have the world's most powerful military. We want to be helpful to both sides. We don't want to be seen as a one-sided country. And so we have many allies in the Middle East, and we think it's very, very important to figure out a way to detoxify the situation, de-radicalize the situation, and bring a lot of these nations into the world of modernity where their people can have the greatest level of success. And so I think there'll be strategies and optionality that come out of the Trump administration that'll be exciting for that region of the world.
Let's talk about Iran. What's after the withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal? With no carrot and just sticks policy, while sticking to no boots on the ground, how will the U.S. contain the heavy Iranian influence expanding throughout the region, from Tehran to Beirut, through Baghdad and Damascus, and down south all the way to Yemen?
Well, the president has a very famous line. If you watch him on TV, he says it often. He says, let's see what happens, or we'll see what happens. And so what I would say to my friends in the region, I would say you have a real friend in President Trump. And what I would say to our historical adversaries, don't underestimate this man. And so I would say that the media likes to report that he's overly simplified the process and there's no complexity to his thought, but the very opposite is happening. And so as he's dismantling that situation, he's going to call for a more secularized, de-radicalized Iranian society. And so if the mullahs there and that theocracy are not prepared for that, I think they're going to get the ground shaken from underneath them in a way that they won't expect from the president.
Are we expecting more sanctions?
Well, that's one of his options. I mean, certainly he put crippling sanctions in place in the North Korean situation. I think North Korea is probably the most sanctioned sovereign nation in history. And so I think that there's that would definitely be something that would be on the table. But I think what he wants to do right now is he wants to let the idea of the breach in that agreement to set, and he wants to see directionally where the Iranians are going. And so if the Iranians are going to push very aggressively for a nuclear arsenal, I think that that's going to be a huge mistake for them and their nation.
How is he going to contain it, though? Sanctions haven't worked in decades.
Well, you know, it's like one of the fun things, and I love being on television with you, but I'm not going to be the guy that tips the president's hand. But as I said, like, let's see what happens, but I would probably send out a warning message to people not to underestimate the president. Don't underestimate him.
Do you see any breakthrough on the Israeli-Palestinian peace front during Trump's term? And how does moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem help with the peace process?
Well, the first thing the movement of the embassy does is it takes that issue off the table. I mean, that's been a standing issue. It's been promised by both Republican and Democratic presidents over the last 25 years. And so there's a very big difference between this president and other presidents. He makes a campaign promise, so he delivered on the campaign promise. The flip side of it is, while that's perceived to be very positive for Prime Minister Netanyahu and for the Israelis, that means that there's now a chit on the table. Remember, the president is a very adept negotiator, so that means there's a chit on the table where there will have to be some kind of give up to the Palestinians. And so I'm not exactly sure what that will be, but one of the first things that the president's going to want is to make sure that there's peace and security for Israel. And so obviously Israel has had historical adversaries in the region. Israel is here to stay. It's a very strong ally of the United States. And I think the president believes, as do many Americans, that there can be a peaceful cohabitation in the region of a Jewish state alongside of Arab states. And so I'm not saying that the Palestinians will get their own state, because right now they are a state sponsor of terrorism. And so you can't have your own state if you're a state sponsoring terrorism. Now, you'll say, well, they're not exactly a state, but they are funding terrorism throughout the region and in Israel. It's absolutely disgusting. It's abhorrent to the average American, and it's certainly, the president finds it offensible. And so there'll be a one-state solution until the Palestinians agree that they want to drop their arms and their terrorism. And so I want you to think back to the situation in Northern Ireland. And so once people decided that there was going to be peace, they created the pathway for opportunity in a negotiated process that led to great prosperity.
I'm going to move on to Syria. After the defeat of ISIS in Syria and Iraq last year, optimism was a la mode concerning the end of the military conflict in Syria. This year, things reverted back to the usual Middle East complications. Israel intensified its air raids against Hezbollah and Iranian targets in Syria. Iran launched missiles on Israeli targets in Golan. Turkey escalated its involvement against empowerment of Syrian Turkish forces. The U.S. One declares its intention to withdraw from the east of the Euphrates. The other day remains Russia's backing of the Syrian regime, and Iranian military presence remains intact. Briefly, the end of the conflict does not seem as close as it appeared. How do you see it coming to an end, under what conditions, and within what time frame?
Okay, so it's a super complicated situation, just by the way you're describing it, and also to understand the historical context in the region. And so I think that what's absolutely clear, and the reason why the Israelis are forced to make those airstrikes, is that over 10,000 rockets are hitting Israel a year. They're coming from Gaza, they're coming from areas north of the Golan Heights, and so Israel feels it has no choice but to strike back. I mean, the Iron Dome is intercepting about 95% of the projectiles that are coming in, but this is nonsensical to peace-loving people. So my recommendation is that there can be a thoughtful process and a de-escalation. It seems that the Assad regime and the Alawite tribe have the full support of the Russians. And so they're probably going to be with us for the foreseeable future, if not, frankly, forever. And so I think there's a deal that can be cut, which allows Syria to stay Syrian, but it gives Israel some peace. But I do think that we have to de-terrorize political organizations like Hezbollah. And without that de-terrorization, I think this conflict will be intractable.
Moving on to Qatar. During your time at the White House, the Qatar blockade had been in effect for about a month and a half. Now, Qatar hosts the largest U.S. military base in the Middle East and the CENTCOM headquarters. Despite this fact, it is being accused of, by Saudi Arabia, as being a sponsor of terrorism. Do you think those two things are compatible?
Well, I mean, look, it's very complicated. I mean, the Qataris obviously have upset their brothers and sisters in the region, and so there's a lot of accusations and mudslinging going from both sides. But it was very clear to me in my time in the White House and in my time after the White House that the president would like to see that rivalry end. He's met with both groups very recently in the White House, and I think it's fair to say, this is probably true about most of us in life, that there's good parts to our personalities and there's good parts to our actions, and there's bad parts to our personalities and bad parts to our actions. And so it would be incumbent upon both sides of the Qatari, non-Qatari situation to try to dial up the best version of themselves and the best version of their countries, because what you don't want to have happen is you don't want this sort of a president to turn his full attention to that area, because you may end up with unintended consequences. And so, my recommendation to everybody there is that peace can be made. Reasonable heads should prevail. I always thought that when I was a kid reading about the Middle East, when I was reading about the 1973 Yom Kippur War, I was thinking to myself back then as a kid, oh boy, when I get older, when I grow up, when I get into my 50s, we're going to be a much smarter generation than our parents and our grandparents, but it turns out that we're not. And so I'm just hoping that people can step up their level of rationality and get this thing right, because there's no reason, when you think about the natural resources in that region, and you think about the intelligence of the human capital in that region, there's no reason why the GCC plus Israel can't be among the fastest growing nations in the world. And so we should be able to help them figure out a way to make that happen.
Why was there a discrepancy at the time between the White House on the one hand and the State Department and the Pentagon on the other hand?
Well, I think in a new administration there was probably some uncoordination or lack of coordination in the communication strategy. And I think on top of that, I think there's probably a struggle between people like the president, who view themselves as disruptors and creative people that are willing to try new things, and people that have been like rock and sediment and concrete as career people inside these departments. So that tension, I think, was very palpable in the beginning, but I think there's been, that impasse has been broken, frankly. I think it's a lot better today than it was 12 or 15 months ago.
Now that the president considers Qatar an ally in the anti-terrorism financing fight, should the U.S. use its leverage with other Gulf states to lift the embargo they have on Qatar, claiming it is a sponsor of terrorism?
Yeah, so I can't speak for that. I think that's unfair for me to speak about, because it's really the president's decision. But what I can do is provide some guidance to people. I think that what the president is looking for is rational discourse, civil behavior, nonviolent behavior, and he's a business person. He wants a lot more commerce in that region. He knows that will help lift people out of poverty. You have less poverty, we both know you're going to have less terrorism. And so if those things are happening, I think there's no reason why you can't lift the embargo. But if those things are not happening, the president's too smart of a guy to be manipulated by anybody. So who's ever hiring the lobbyists in Washington that are making the cases to lift the embargoes, what will really be more successful are actions as opposed to just a form of words and persuasion.
So what are we expecting in the summit that's coming up in September for the GCC?
Well, it's a little early, but I think what we're hopeful for is that a lot of these situations that are out there right now that are causing this impasse can be negotiated through diplomacy, and hopefully by the end of the year you'll just have a better situation. I don't think it's good for the Qataris or the Saudis to be in this level of hot rivalry. So we have to figure out a way if we can dial back those tensions. Some people that I've spoken to, I was in Saudi Arabia recently and have been other parts of the region, some people think that it's unforgivable, but the truth of the matter is if the United States and Germany and Japan can be allies, and they can be successful allies for 70 years, given what happened and the atrocities that happened during the war 75 years ago, most things people can look past and get beyond.
Let's talk about what's going on here in the U.S. Why do you call President Trump a blue-collar president?
Well, I mean, his son Don Jr. used to call him the blue-collar billionaire because there's a simpatico that he has for working-class people. He grew up as a developer. His father was a developer, and in building a lot of this housing in Brooklyn and Queens, he worked alongside of people that were paycheck to paycheck and that were carrying a lunch pail to work. I think of my own father. I grew up in a blue-collar family. It was resoundingly middle class, but neither of my parents went to college. And so one thing that's unique about the president, even though his building is less than 2 blocks from here that he lived in, the Trump Tower, and he lived a very highfalutin billionaire's lifestyle, he was in touch with and had empathy for common people. And I saw that throughout the campaign. And so the title of my book is The Blue Collar President, because He is somebody that actually understands the dilemma, the economic anxiety, and in some cases the economic desperation of working class people. And by the way, working class people not only here in the United States, but around the globe. He successfully predicted the Brexit because of that angst and that anxiety. And he's really trying to come up with policies that will help those people. Because what he understands about the world economy is that if you can bolster wages for the lower working class and for the middle working class, those wage boosts will lead to more disposable income and more aggregate demand for the world. And so the pathway for global growth is through the American breadbasket. It's through the American middle class and working class families. And so one of the reasons why the president went to Davos this year is that there's a duality to his personality. He wants to let people know that he wants to be part of the world system, but he wants to put Americans first because he knows that that's better for everybody.
So you're saying that he is serving the interests of his blue-collar base.
Correct.
Okay. How is he doing that with a tariff increase on steel, for example, with repealing Obamacare?
So let's take them separately. And so the reason why he's increasing the tariffs on steel is that if you look at our trading partners and you take a 75-year historical analysis of trade with the rest of the world, the United States made a very big macro decision right after the Second World War. Last standing industrial economy, we were controlling about 65% of the world's GDP. The other nations, the other industrialized nations, were effectively decimated. And so we did two things. We created the Marshall Plan, and then we set up the trade deal so that they were literally uneven with the U.S. Goods and services could flow freely into the United States, roughly unembargoed, but we accepted embargoes and quotas as our goods and services were being sold into other nations. We did that because we wanted them to protect their markets, and we wanted to create a burgeoning and rising, economically interdependent middle class. That had a great outcome for the world. The United States, when you think of Dean Atkinson or George Marshall or Robert Lovett or Harry Truman, they knew that the path to less conflict is through prosperity. And so they wanted the world to be economically interdependent. One of the negative side effects of that, though, is that it has hurt the manufacturing base of the country and it has hurt wages in the U.S. Wages have effectively been stagnant for the last 35 years. We saw some growth recently, but they've been very stagnant. And so where the president is saying is, I'll cut my tariffs. He made a statement very recently where he said, we'll go to a tariff-free world. No problem. He just wants the American worker to compete on an equal playing field with other workers. If you take a Harley-Davidson, like a Model 883 Harley-Davidson, it sells for $9,000 here in the United States, but because of the tariffs and regulations and excise taxes, it sells for $20,000 in Europe, or actually in Germany. And so this discrepancy makes it very hard for the Americans to export goods and services elsewhere. And so all the president's saying is those times of us being willing to accept that unevenness are over. The world has grown. China came into the World Trade Organization as a developing nation. If you understand the advantages that a developing nation has over a developed nation in the WTO, they're very significant. It's 18 years later, China is the second largest economy in the United States and about to become the largest economy. By 2035, they will be, by and large, the largest economy in the world. They should not have the status in the World Trade Organization as a developing nation. And so when we're talking about these tariffs, the president is using the tariffs as a cudgel in the negotiating process. He would ideally like to have no tariffs, and he'd ideally like to have a reduction in tariffs across the board so we can move to a real, true, free and fair trade standard internationally, as opposed to the uneven trade, or what the president is now calling the foolish trade standards that we've had in the past.
President Trump's supporters depict him as a Washington outsider who wants to deliver change and shake the establishment, but is being faced with a strong resistance from the deep state. The FBI, the judiciary, the bureaucracy, the actions and campaigns against him based on allegations of ties to Russia, Islamophobia/racism, or more recently, prostitution. It's always the deep state for Trump supporters. In your opinion and experience, is there such a thing?
It's a really good question. I don't know if there's necessarily a deep state, but I do think that there is a collective interest of people that have enjoyed the status quo. I used to be friends with Steve Bannon. We're not friends anymore, but when we were friends, we did agree that the swamp, the Washington swamp, was a business model for a very large group of people. So when you bring in somebody like President Trump that wants to disrupt that wants to focus more on the interests of the average American as opposed to these people's self-interest. That is opposed to the status quo. And so I'm not necessarily saying there's a deep state, and I'm not a big believer in conspiracy theory, but I do think that each person's individual bias becomes a collective, and they look at President Trump as a threat to their long-standing business models and their long-standing lobbying relationships and the way they curry favor with each other. And so, yes, there's been a movement against him.
Last but not least, this interview is about you. Where do you see yourself in the near future? Will you be back in the public sector, or are you going to stay in the private sector?
No, I appreciate it. I'm going to stay in the private sector. It's not to say that I didn't enjoy my time, even though it was only 11 days. I was with the president for 2 years on the campaign, and I worked for several months for him on his transition team, where I was one of the executive committee members. But I see myself helping him in the re-election, and I see myself still as a media advocate for him and his agenda. And it's not necessary for me at this point to go back into the administration and do those things, because I get a lot of that stuff done outside of the administration. But more important than all of that, I'm not going to be asked to go back, okay? Because at the end of the day, New Yorkers have a different style than these Washingtonians. We like telling the truth, and they don't like the truth in Washington, and so there's no reason for me to return there.
Thank you very much.
Nice to be
here. This is it.
Thank you.
إلى هنا مشاهدينا نصل إلى نهاية حديث خاص. شكرا جزيلا لحسن المتابعة وإلى اللقاء.